Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, friends. Thank you so much for joining us today. We know that it's not really the most convenient weather outside, but we do hope that as we go ahead, we'll be able to brighten up proceedings considerably, at least inside the room, by making sense of a muddle which has been very difficult to make sense over. But it's a great pleasure for us to have three very eminent experts joining here today. And while I will have the pleasure of introducing them subsequently, I just wanted to share with you a little bit of a background about why we are having this conversation, because as all of you know, there is too much that has been spoken on the Trump tariffs, and too much, I suppose, is left to be spoken on these tariffs as they go through a period of examination, review, adjustment, and even scrutiny, depending upon which side of the camp you belong to. But when it comes to Asia, I just want to, by way of easier categorization, I just want to distinguish Asia broadly into two groups with respect to Trump tariffs. One is those countries with whom the United States has reached a deal. And there are a large number of countries in that respect. So beginning from Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, practically all countries have had a deal with the United States, though none of us has really seen those deals. We have heard about those deals and there is confirmation on the deals, but none of them have really come out on official paper. We broadly are aware of what has been the content of these deals in some respect. But even smaller countries from the region, like, for example, Cambodia on one side, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, they have all been able to reach some deals with the United States. As a result of those deals, the original reciprocal tariffs that were announced on these countries on the 2nd of April have been revised for practically all of them. There are a group of countries which haven't yet reached deals with the United States. And the two most prominent countries are China and India. With China, the negotiations are going on, and there is a truce that is currently existing between the US and China, which, if I'm correct, is probably going to end sometime in early November, Debbie, the 90-day period, mid-November. And there are expectations that before that, there might be an APEC meeting, which will see the two heads of states, US and China, meeting. And perhaps there will be some outcome from that. And obviously, India, too, has not been able to reach a deal with the United States, with the result that it is left with one of the highest rates of tariffs right now, and a combined rate of 50%. There are other countries of Asia, from Asia rather, with whom the US didn't really talk about a deal. I think Singapore is one of those countries. And there wasn't really the prospect of a deal. It wasn't really a part of those select group of countries who were picked out for reciprocal tariffs. So with that kind of a categorization, we find the Asian region in a bit of a mess, to put it that way. So there are countries which are now saddled with various bits of tariffs on them, which are the reciprocal tariffs. There are countries which are negotiating, and two of the largest economies of the world continue to negotiate with the US. And there are countries with whom the US hasn't spoken at all. And there's a certain kind of stability with respect to the relationships between them and the United States, most notably because those have not been subject to any friction till now. But what this means is that there are a number of tariffs which are existing around us. So there's 20% for some, 25% for some, there's 18% for some. So these are all the reciprocal tariffs that have been imposed. The story doesn't end there. There's another bunch of tariffs which have been effective from before the reciprocal tariffs came in. Those were the Section 232 tariffs, which were levied on steel and aluminium and automobiles and auto parts. These are for those items being exported to the United States from any countries. And obviously, there's a question of checking out whether the reciprocal tariffs and these product specific tariffs are getting stacked up or not. What are the specific provisions that are coming out from there? With respect to China, the People's Republic of China, there was separate Section 301 tariffs, which were imposed from earlier before, even during the Biden administration, and those continue. So the net result of all this, and I think I shouldn't forget to mention even the transshipment tariffs, which are going to be imposed upon the discretion of the US Customs and Border Protection in terms of deciding the uh, local value content and how they come in. So what this means is that if we go back by even a period of, let us say, 9 months and look at the 1st of January of 2025, coming from there, it's a completely different world as far as tariffs are concerned, because till that point in time, the US was operating on the MFN tariffs, except the Section 232 tariffs and a few other tariffs. It's a completely different world that is now being encountered by businesses, supply chain managers, and so on and so forth. So that's one part of the story. And this is something on which we will try to make some sense, because the impression that is now coming up is there's probably a thinking among countries that who has been better off at the end of the announcement of all these tariffs. Does a 18% vis-a-vis a 22% necessarily mean that the 18% recipient is better off than the 22%? Or there's something more to it? So there's one part of that story. The second part of the story is that by now it is also becoming quite clear that no deal with the US and Donald Trump is good enough. There's more in the pipeline. And what might those be? And that is something that we want to explore in the second part of the title that we have. What lies ahead? So, is it that the tariffs have been just the beginning of a period of a very different kind of coercive economic engagement on part of the United States with countries in Asia? And this engagement is now going to move on to a next period where the tariffs will be used with other tools, economic tools, foreign policy tools, and so on and so forth, to extract whatever the US would want to extract in this relationship. Is that what we are expecting? So clearly, there's much that is necessary to be understood. And I think from this extremely eminent group of speakers that I have around me, we would try to get an idea about what these directions could be as we look forward over the next maybe at least 1 year, at least before the US midterm elections are due by around November 2026, which could be a bit of a turning point in the whole story. So without further ado, let me now, with that background, introduce my colleagues on this discussion. We would be beginning with Ms. Elizabeth Chilaya, and all of their bios are extremely impressive, and impressive bios are lengthy bios. So I'm not going to really read those out, except for mentioning that Liz, as we call her, she is somebody who really has been one of the veterans as far as regional trade negotiations and uh, taking part in trade conversations and trade policy debates and discussions are concerned from a policy perspective. And she's right now the principal trade specialist at the Ministry of Trade and Industry in Singapore. So, Liz, very happy to have you over here with us. And we always look forward to hearing you, and today is no exception. I'll then be joined by Dr. Deborah Elms. Again, Debbie is somebody who I wouldn't use the term that she needs no introduction. You don't need an introduction. I'll give you your latest introduction, which is you are now at the Hinrich Foundation in Singapore. Debbie is heading the head of trade policy over there. We have had multiple engagements together, including with the World Economic Forum and so on and so forth. And it's always been a great pleasure to work alongside Debbie in my own capacity. I've learned an incredible amount of rare insights while being with her. And so, Debbie, welcome and thank you so much for being here again. And finally, Stephen Olson. So Steve is sort of in familiar turf in the sense that while Steve is here with us today, he's formerly with our neighbor, the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. So we will not be accused of poaching, but it's always a privilege to have him on board because he doesn't mince words. He kind of is fond of shooting from the hip, if I can use a Texan terminology, Steve, with risk at this point in time. But again, Steve and I, we have collaborated on a large number of projects, including what ISAS has done on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And we continue to do collaborative work together. And Steve, delighted to be having you here with us today. So with that, Mary, let me begin with you. 10 minutes of your thoughts on the subject, and then we go around. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon to everybody. It is quite the hot topic. In fact, this morning I was at the SBFC Center for the Future of Trade and Investment event with DPM Gan and Acting Minister Jeffrey Sao on the impact of US tariffs and what Singapore businesses can expect. And at SBF, we launched a new AI generative website called TAIA, T-A-I-A, to help businesses navigate this situation. But, all these AI, or even for yourself, as you go through all this, you can only check if there's something in writing somewhere. So let's start with the three buckets of Asian countries that Dr. Pandit referred to. I'll start with Singapore first. Actually, Singapore is in conversations. We are just not highlighting it. But, DPM Gan has spoken about his earlier trip to the United States. He's had a video call with Latnik, and there will probably be continuing discussions along the way. Because we have seen that Singapore has come up with sort of like the best deal, 10%. And can I just clarify, it's additional 10%. That word is forgotten in media. It is not that all our exports are facing a flat 10%. No, it is an additional 10% or whatever was the earlier MFN rate. And for those who still qualify under the US-Singapore FTA, then instead of paying preferential 0, you're paying 10%. So it's not so straightforward. We are monitoring to see whether in reality, is this what their US importers are being taxed? I would just use the word tax, It takes some time because, CPB, as you can imagine, is extremely busy with all the new executive orders and all the instructions they are coming with on a daily basis on the new HS classification and reversing orders and, the whole fiasco over gold that caused such a financial spike and fear in our financial markets recently. So we are not sure whether exactly what the importers are paying is what Mr. Trump intended. We think that most of our importers in the US are good US MNCs because that's the bulk of our trade that's going into the US is by the US MNCs who are here. And, we also understand that in the US, and please, Deb and Stephen can correct me because you will understand your system a bit better. But our understanding is that there's also a tiered approach like we have for ST+. And so US CPB may not be checking each and every preferential claim or claim being made by these big MNCs in the United States. So, but we are just presuming that is how it is because that's how we are interpreting it and nobody has given us a contradiction. So what then is Singapore trying to get further clarity on is on the unknown upcoming pharmaceutical tariffs because we do quite a lot of trade in pharma APIs. Of course, I'm looking at Europe. We do most with Europe, but a lot as well growing with the US, especially after Pfizer established their presence here following the COVID situation. So we are looking more into seeing what is to be expected, what is it that we can do in discussions to try and see how to mitigate and get the best outcome for that sector. We have not as yet paid that sufficient depth to the impact of the 232 tariffs on steel, aluminium, and copper, but we are already getting feedback from some of our local companies like Secret Lab, the gaming chair, and because the chair has got steel, it's got aluminium, and it's got copper. So you are having stacked tariffs. So how do we look into and help these companies which are facing that sort of, because everything is being stacked. It's not one or the other, it's one plus plus. And so there are very innovative approaches. I understand that the financial consultants are working with such companies on tax planning, transfer pricing. How do you mitigate? Because your value. So how are you valuing the imported goods? How you're changing it? What sort of Incoterms maybe you're using to mitigate and pay the lowest amount based on the tariff rate that's going to be assigned. So it's big business for PwC and all the other consultants. So that's where Singapore is. And then at the same time, we are trying our best to understand how Singapore business is dealing with this situation. As you know, we are in a deficit, so it's not as though we have so much trade exporting to the US. We are importing much more. But for those that are exporting, is there anything we can do to help them ride out this situation, which is where the SBF playbook on make sense, take action, plan ahead, I think, or is it maybe in reverse order, is that what now we are at the take action stage. So, we are trying to guide, and one of the most important overlooked issues is finance. How are these SMEs, going to wait? How long can they wait before they need to be paid? Because they need to pay their employees, and also what are the financing terms. We have been working very closely with DBS and UOB to see how they are trying to improve or help the SMEs with this uncertainty, because some of them may not be being paid immediately because of all this uncertainty over the tariffs. So it's not just investments, it's also the payments which is being impacted. So that's what we are trying to do. And as my minister has announced, there'll be a business adaptation grant bag that will be announced next month for those companies who are facing the problem. So, but you notice that most of what we are actually trying to help the companies with is on the reciprocal tariffs. We have not as yet tried to see what we really need to do, or whether the 232 action, the 301, is justified, because in Trump 1, when such challenges were raised, he just cited national security, refused to say it was a safeguard, and nothing could be changed. So we are being a bit cautious there. We're trying to see what other partners are going to react to this. We are all watching the outcome of the IEEPA judgment, but we know he's got something in his back pocket. He's just going to shift it too. So then that brings us to the other bunch of countries in Asia, those that have done deals. Nothing in writing. The only one that has something in writing is the EU, where the EU, does say that is the first step towards an FTA to try and say that it is part of a GATT 24 MFN exception, because that is the challenge now for the rest of us. These deals, my good friends in ASEAN, when they're trying to give better treatment to the United States without the guide of a FTA, what does this mean? We can challenge it. Are we going to then see a whole breakdown of the MFN system because it is not an FTA? So candidly, and this is really candidly, because I know quite a few of the ASEAN negotiators we all were in Geneva at one stage in time. It is probably a who blinks first. So their intention is to make sure they get a reduced reciprocal tariff. If the US wants to grant this without seeing anything being delivered on the other side, is it really going to be zero tariffs? Many people are going to say, how are you identifying a US import? without a preferential trade agreement, do you then need to have an agreement to say what are the criteria for US origin? Or are you using the domestic MFN criteria, ordinary certificate? So there's a lot of debate for the lawyers. I was at ASIL last week and we had a great time talking about all these nitty-gritties about all that. So that's where you have the deals. And then you can even see, even from Japan, there's different interpretation as to what the deal really surmounted to. And there's nothing writing. And the deal is now going much more beyond tariffs. You are looking at certain types of investment. You're looking at buying of planes. You're looking at allowing US beef to be imported into your country. So there's this a whole variation of deals that are being done, but nothing in writing. You don't really know whether it's a proper trade agreement that can be enforced. So that's why amongst us legal trade nerds last week, we say maybe it's a who blinks first. Okay, apart from the EU, which is trying very hard, but the may not pass the commission because they're also asking why are we giving zero and we are not getting zero back and stuff like that. So it raises a lot of issues. Are you doing this deals because he's a deal maker and you want to meet with him? I was told also candidly that you can't meet the White House unless you have something substantial to offer. So it's like, it is really like business suddenly, what am I going to offer? What am I trying to get in exchange? And you don't ask for what you're getting in exchange. Is that I'm offering this in the hope that you will reduce whatever tariff you're going to impose on me. So it's quite wild, wild west. I keep on telling my young officers to rewatch episodes of The Apprentice. Because he'll give you some guidance as to how he's thinking. He loves to say you're fired and he keeps on changing things here. So it's a moving target. Then for poor India, suddenly, you're raising the goalpost because saying, oh, because you're buying Russian oil, I don't like it. And look about Brazil, because you're treating the former president badly, so I don't like you. So I'm going to punish you this way. The only one, actually, in my personal view, where there's less of this cowboyish tactics is China. Because I think he fears China in some ways. Maybe it's the Fed, maybe it's the fact that China holds a lot of US dollars, and then he called pause, or he called pause because some say Walmart said, well, I'm importing everything from China and I can't have empty shelves. And then there was a pause. So it is a very interesting dynamics when you see about how he's doing the tariffs. And the initial assumption as to why he was doing all these tariffs is because he needed money. As a businessman, I often tell my officers that he's a president who has inherited a country, but is actually a company that should file for Chapter 11. He cannot file for Chapter 11, so he needs to increase the revenue. There's a potential of another, financial pause again because he doesn't have money. And so he's been trying to argy-bargy everywhere. So is that why he's just pursuing these deals because he needs the money in to avoid another shutdown? But then if he's really trying to do that, why did he come up with a big, beautiful bill which does not help him increase his domestic revenue? So it's a very complicated man, but a complicated man who likes to be seen to be in power, making deals and giving his own interpretation of the deals. So what can we expect going forward? There are two scenarios that we are watching. Who is decoupling from whom? Talking to the businesses, there's only so much they can tolerate with the uncertainty. Some of them are still keen to continue to supply goods. And remember, we are just primarily talking about goods, services, and all out of the equation to the US because they make great profits. But they are also monitoring the situation to know that this profit margin may not last because the US has other problems domestically. You have rising inflation, rising unemployment. So are the Americans still going to buy, as I candidly said, a pair of jeans a day? And that's what makes them such a lucrative market, or are they also having to slow down? And then will our businesses still see it's worth tolerating all this nonsense because of that profit margin? At the moment, we have some businesses for which we tell them to get a very good trade compliance team, because the situation changes every day. I have the US CPB alerts coming in every night, and it's at least 10 coming in. Sometimes it's just to say they're under maintenance or whatever, but there's a lot coming in. So you need to pay attention, you need to know. And some of these alerts tell you that the classification of your good is changing. They're coming up with new HS codes, as you know. So you really need to be compliant. Then you really need to be very aware of how you do valuation. And this is where the transshipment issue also comes in. How are you valuing the goods? Is it possible to value it in such a way so that your duty burden is less? And this is what the consultants are advising. But for the rest of the companies who are now thinking twice about continuing to just have the US as their market, for Singapore, we say, well, we have opened up 27 other free trade area agreements for you. You have a lot of choice. There's more certainty because we're talking about preferential tariff treatment. And of course, the jewel in the crown that we are trying to emphasize is ASEAN. ASEAN has got double the population of the United States taken as a whole. We are soon going to be ASEAN 11 because Timor-Leste will join us in October. You have rising middle class, rising purchasing power. So as I said, we in ASEAN may not be buying a pair of jeans a day because, but I see the young people, the way they spend money, maybe yes. But it'll be enough to help you on that consumer. And it's also worthwhile noting that there are three actually categories of goods that are being traded. Consumer goods, you have your electronic goods, which are put in their own separate category, and then you have infrastructure. Okay, so depending on where you are, what are you doing, how are you going to diversify your supply chain to find new markets or have a backup market or concurrent, because you need money. You need money to continue manufacturing the goods. You need money to pay your employees. You need money to keep the lights on. So you cannot afford to perpetually be selling with uncertainty where your US buyer may suddenly cancel the contract and you have a lot of downside implications. So that's in terms of businesses having a plan B. But to answer the question as to whether the deals are never good enough is never. He's trying all sorts of permutation. He's linking it to all sorts of issues. So the question I ask back, and maybe we can chat about this later, when is enough is enough? The more we are running to do deals with the US also clouds the issue for me, for the US importers, because they may think that it's true, yes, I'm not the one bearing the tariff burden when actually they are, because all the exporting countries are running to do deals. So must be they are having the burden and they are trying to, they don't see it as the comparative tariff advantage that these countries are trying to get. No matter what the tariff rate is, 10%, 19%, 50%, whatever, the burden is on the US buyer. And they don't see that yet. So we were just talking this morning that maybe it'll be end November, early December, when suddenly Trump forewarned this, only expect one Barbie doll. They may not even have a Barbie doll. They may not have a Christmas tree because the Chinese exports of Christmas tree and Christmas ornaments, they are tightening their belt and say, we don't want to be bullied. We are going to find other markets. So is that when the US electorate will wake up and say, what is really going on? And then will be a tempering to the deals. But without that, he's just going to link anything he can. And as long as we entertain him by going to further discuss it with him, he sees himself as still in power and calling all the shots. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miri. And that was an excellent overview of the issues that we are engaging with. So, Debbie, now over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I know a lot of people in this room are not trade experts. So let me try to explain to you why this is so challenging. First, let me just say that we've had 80 years of economic integration that has now been smashed onto the floor. So one of the challenges that we've got is that the systems that have been in place for everyone's professional career is now in pieces. Doesn't mean we're done trading. It doesn't mean we're not going to have cooperation, collaboration, et cetera, but it does mean it's going to look very different going forward. And we're at this weird moment where we've got all of this sort of shattered pottery, if you will, on the ground, and we have to figure out how are we going to put the pieces back together. We're not going to reglue it the way it was. And what's peculiar about that for most of us, I think, is that's not how you usually approach your, professional life. These things are sort of a certain way. You expect them to be a certain way. Of course, there's changes around the margins. Sometimes there's a bit of a shock, but it's not sort of everything smooshed on the floor at once. And so that's really where we're at. And that is extremely unsettling. So just to give you a sense, especially those of you who aren't in the trade weeds, let me just go through the last few days changes, and then let me turn to a couple of changes coming in the next few days. We're not talking months, years, whatever, just days. So what has changed as an example? This is just my rough list that I thought of as I sat here. So one is, many of you in the room will know that Trump has now imposed a second kind of tariff on India. So India was already subjected to a 25% tariff. It got a secondary tariff added just a few days ago at 25% for purchases of Russian oil shipments. Now, this whole secondary tariff idea, totally new. We never had a secondary tariff in place. This was just this is an all made up concept from the Trump administration. But the net result is 50% tariffs against India applied despite lots of efforts trying to make a deal. India thought they were going to have a deal. And then not only did they not get a deal, but they had 25% plus 25%. And so trying to figure out how do we manage 50% tariffs is a challenge. India is not that trade exposed to the United States. So that's the good news. The bad news is that if you're in one of the sectors that does try to export to the United States, of course, catastrophic. 50% tariffs can make you completely unviable in the US, or at least far more difficult, trade with far more difficulty. So this whole idea of new and innovative approaches to tariffs represented in the last couple of days. We also had another change in a trade policy called de minimis. So de minimis is if you ship goods, well, this is how it was a couple days ago. If you shipped goods to the United States at under $800 US was the US threshold, then you did not have to pay tariffs and you did not have to fill out the full customs paperwork. That went away for the US for China and Hong Kong shipments at the beginning in April. That is now revoked for everybody. There's no more de minimis. So what has happened as a result of that? Well, as it turns out, 81% of all shipments sent through the US Postal Service are now gone. You cannot, if you were in Singapore and you thought you were going to send a package to a friend of yours in the US, forget it, because for the moment, SingPost is not accepting packages to the United States. They will sort this out eventually, and you will have to pay, especially if you're a commercial vendor, you will have to pay tariffs, HS codes. You will have to pay someone to collect that for you, plus the shipping charges. So your costs just went up tremendously. And we'll see how many gift purchases ultimately also get caught by this, because right now the limit is about $100 US for gifts. So the de minimis change coming hard, coming very fast. That was not anticipated. Now suddenly, So small businesses in particular are in real trouble because a lot of them use the de minimis shipments to get into the United States, but now gone for the US. We've had on Friday night, Trump loves to do stuff on Friday night. He loves to wreck my Saturday morning. So I thank him very much for that personally. Friday night, we had we need a Friday night massacre kind of a thing. Friday night this week, he announced changes to the reciprocal tariff rates and then proceeded to put out 108 pages of annex adjustments to existing reciprocal tariff rates. That involved a number of things. It's super complicated. It's probably less relevant for you, but basically some stuff got added. So now they're subject to reciprocal rates. A few things got taken off, including potentially stuff the United States doesn't make itself, like coffee, bananas, and weirdly for me, cork. I think because the wine industry had a fit about this, so they've changed cork. But the point is that and they were announced on Friday night, take effect on Monday. right? So that is head spinning, right? This is like, holy cow, if you had stuff that you were planning, now you have to figure out what are the new tariff rates that you're going to have to pay. You might not have been subject to tariffs on Friday, and now you're subject to tariffs on Monday. Some of this is retroactive. So then you have to figure out, well, now what did we have from before? Do we need to adjust our existing paperwork and pay additional tariffs? Maybe we get a refund, although they're not big on refunds at the moment. So the complexity of the reciprocal rates is changing. Again, this was Friday that this happened. Also, in the last couple of days, the US-Japan agreement sort of came out. And what also came out is a separate document. We haven't seen the document, although it's floating around, but we've seen reports of the document for the investment side of this reciprocal tariff deal with Japan, which is really eye-watering. I mean, it is such a one-sided document. It is an astonishing thing where the Japanese apparently agreed to pay $550 billion at the discretion of the White House within 45 days, with the money to be spent before Trump leaves the White House. Huh. That's quite remarkable, right? And then I suppose we would say, no surprise, right? The Prime Minister of Japan has now announced his withdrawal from office, because you can imagine the backlash taking place in Japan. We've also had, and I'm sure all of you saw, attached to all of this trade stuff is some challenges domestically, including on immigration policy. And the one that hits Asia particularly hard was the raid on the Hyundai plant and the chain gang removal of Korean nationals from this plant to put them on detention flights back, fortunately for them, to Korea, not to some dreadful place, but still. Like that is that's not something that you saw. And so that's also last couple of days, right? So this is all in the trade and economic space in the last few days. Looking ahead, what are we going to see? Just to give you some more fun times ahead, the entire legal basis for, or let me rephrase that, most of the legal basis for Trump's current actions rests on one statute called the Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA. IEPA has been challenged in the US court system. The administration has lost 3 court cases on this. So they filed the cases, lost, appealed the cases, lost again. Now it has to go to the Supreme Court, which is the top court in the United States. We may find out as early as tomorrow, our Thursday morning. So again, another joyous morning. Whether or not the Supreme Court will take up the case. And that's going to be very interesting for a whole variety of reasons, not the least of which because the Supreme Court will decide, does the president have the authority to invoke IEPA, emergency powers, for trade deficits and for fentanyl? Those were his first 2 excuses. And if he has the authority to impose those as an economic emergency, can he use tariffs as the punishment for that economic emergency? So sort of 2 parts that have been, again, so far courts have said no to one or both of those. The Supreme Court will decide both of those parts, plus a third element I think the Supreme Court will have to look at, which is where is the role of the president and where is the role of Congress? And this gets complicated because the US Constitution doesn't say a lot of things, but the one task it gives, the one actually written down task it gives to Congress is that Congress is responsible for regulating foreign trade at the time it was in tariffs and duties. So the congressional branch has over the years given a lot of authority to the executive branch, but not probably this level of authority. And so the Supreme Court will have to decide on separation of powers in a way that will be extremely explosive in this case. And again, we may find out as early as tomorrow whether or not the Supreme Court has agreed to take up the case. If they take up the case, then we will, which I assume that they will, although you never know. If the Supreme Court says no, just to give you a heads up, then the Trump administration is lost. So the Supreme Court then would say, we stick with the lower court ruling, the administration loses, IEPA goes away, and all hell breaks loose. Because now we have to figure out what to do for legal authority for these tariffs. They have some secondary backup ideas in place, but they're not immediate. There will be this incredible stampede of firms that have paid tariffs that will be applying for refunds. It's unclear whether they get them, whether they will ever get them, whether they will never get them. We don't know, but it will be just a big mess. So that's this week. We have a couple of changes coming up that I think are very interesting. There is a new change for because the United States is obsessed with lots of things for national security purposes, but one of them is shipbuilding. So the United States has now imposed very expensive fees on China-built and China-operated ships, like container ships, bulk carrier ships, et cetera, that are to take effect on October 14th. So that's not very far from now. And those are cripplingly expensive fees that are supposed to take effect. And so the result of that, among other things, is the container fleets and the bulk carrier fleets and the car shipment, the ro-ro shipping fleets, all of which you can see coming through Singapore, are all being redirected because you don't want to use any China-built or China-operated ship into the US. So you need to deploy them somewhere else, which means you need to switch the shipping lines around to make sure that non-Chinese ships go to the US. Now you may say, well, what does that have to do with anything? Actually, that has a lot to do with a lot of things because it really changes the shipping routes that are available and not available. The result of all of this chaos, so we'll see what happens on October 14th or before October 14th, but you can already see changes in shipping taking place. Because the United States is having such disruption in trade, in inbound traffic, there is you might imagine, right? Less inbound traffic. There's just less stuff going to the United States from overseas. Now that creates, again, some secondary effects that some folks in Washington don't seem to have thought about. One of which is, if you are not sending stuff to the United States, you are not getting, crucially, containers and ships, but we'll talk about containers for a moment, into the United States, which means that you don't actually have the box to put the stuff in to send United States exports back out again. So this is becoming a real problem, actually. There is a real shortage of containers in the US that is now snowballing to be hugely disruptive. So if you wanted to ship exports from the United States, you can't get a box to put them in and you can't find a ship to put them on. So, again, second order effects, really, really challenging. And then we have, and this is the last point that I'll just make in this opening, and again, I'm happy to take questions from people. The Section 232s, which are already in effect, are deeply problematic. That is the fallback for the Trump administration when they or if they lose again on IEEPA. One solution is to use these Section 232s for national security purposes much more widely. Now, they're problematic for a number of reasons. One of them is that they're incredibly expansive. So we have them on auto and auto parts at 25%. We have them on steel and aluminum at 50%, but and then 50% at copper. The kicker, though, is what is included in those lists of the products, and what are called derivatives is a long and constantly growing list of more and more stuff that gets put into the derivatives bucket. So that it's all chairs with metal in them, it's microphones with metal in them, et cetera. The same thing may continue to happen because they keep opening up new opportunities to add to the lists. There's no real opportunity to remove from these lists, but you can add to these lists. And so we're getting longer and longer derivative lists. And we have 8 more cases in the pipeline for Section 232s, including, as Liz pointed out, for pharmaceuticals. That one matters for Singapore. Another one that matters a lot for this region is semiconductors. And when they say semiconductors, it doesn't just mean the chip. It means potentially anything that embeds a chip. All of your phones, your laptops, your storage devices, but it might mean your vacuum cleaner, right? Anything with a chip in it could be put on a derivative list and subject to whatever is the Section 232 tariff on semiconductors. Those tariff rates so far have been at 25 or 50%, but there's no reason why it has to stay at either one of those. It could be 82%, it could be 12% tariffs. We just don't know. And it's subject to whatever the Trump decides. And it's crucially not easily reviewed by anyone. So unlike IEEPA, where you could get a lawsuit and maybe you win, it's much harder to win a lawsuit on Section 232s. And Section 232s last forever. forever. Once those are in place for national security purposes, those are going to be a real nightmare to get rid of. And so as they expand into pharma, semiconductors, lumber includes not just lumber, but anything that might be made of lumber, including all of your furniture and dining room tables and kitchen cabinets and all sorts of things. Lumber, unmanned aircraft, wind turbines. I mean, the list is just enormous and continuously growing on Section 232s. So those are in the pipeline. Many of those cases are done and ready to be dropped at any moment. So the reason I point them out in the next couple of days is that anytime Trump gets mad about something, he goes for trade first. And so, you know, now that he's got these national security cases ready to go, anytime he feels like he's under a threat for whatever reason, new Section 232 announced probably Friday night to take effect probably Monday morning. And so I would expect that could happen in the next couple of days. And all of that risk and uncertainty is continuing to be compounded. And the last point that I would just make is the saving grace in all of this chaos is that so far, and again, I would knock on potentially tariffed lumber, we don't see this replicated outside of the United States. So while the US continues to be nutty and very protectionist and heading into very bizarre places, most of the rest of the world has not yet followed, which I think is great news. But I don't think we should be too relaxed about that, because once you've indicated and you sort of smashed the norms of behavior and you've shown that you can do all kinds of wild and crazy things, you've opened the door for lots of other governments that also may want to do wild and crazy things to do so. And there's no constraints or fewer constraints on their behavior than anyone perhaps imagined. And so while you can say this is a Trump specific problem, and at the moment it clearly is, it doesn't necessarily stay a Trump specific problem. It becomes a systemic issue, and it becomes a problem that could get replicated in other ways in other markets. And so the disruption and the discomfort that I think we all feel is real and is likely to persist for, I'm afraid to say, a much longer period of time than many of us perhaps had hoped. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, JP. That's one of the reasons why I'm always intimidated to be on a panel with you. You know, you make the future sound so bleak. Beginning from
It's a bummer.
the next Friday.
Seriously, like you just, I mean, I am normally an optimistic person. And since, you know, the beginning of January, I've been like, oh my God, you know, it's just disaster after disaster. And everybody wants the silver lining, but, you know, sometimes there isn't one, or there isn't much of one.
Too much of metal around us, you know, in every sense. But the brilliant observations. I mean, really, it's such a, you know, experience to be with you, to learn these things. I mean, when you go beneath what's there on the policy and the actions, it's really fantastic. And Steve, before I turn to you, I mean, just to, as we said, to accelerate the process, just to let you know that we are, this one is being streamed live on the Facebook, and we have around 40 people in addition to what is going on here. So all for the sake of posterity, as it will eventually go up. So there you go. Over to you.
Thanks. Thank you, Amitendo, very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Real pleasure to be here, and a big thank you to our hosts for their kind invitation. Well, look, I think Elizabeth and Deborah have done an excellent job in kind of walking us through this chaotic landscape we're all living through. So what I'd like to do is just focus on a small number of points that I think are important, but perhaps aren't being as fully absorbed and recognized as I think they should be. And the first point I would make is things are not going to get better. Okay, things are not going to settle down. Chaos, understand, chaos is the point. Chaos is not a bug in Trump's system. Chaos is a feature. He thinks if we're all running around, ripping our hair out, as Deborah says, waking up to check what the latest announcement is, he thinks that works to his advantage. And he's told us point blank, he thinks unpredictability is his greatest asset. Now, as absurd as that sounds as a way to run trade policy, I think we're viewing it through the wrong prism if we look at this from the point of view of how to run a trade policy, because I don't think that's the prism that Donald Trump uses. I would suggest to you that the prism through which Donald Trump views all of these things is not as a trade policy official, not as a trade negotiator, but as the executive producer of a reality television show. And when you're running a reality television show, the objective is to keep all the eyes on me, keep the audience guessing, keep the audience tuning in, what will happen this week, what will happen next week, manufacture a crisis, solve a crisis, create drama. And so I think that's the correct prism for viewing the way he's running things. And that's why I say I don't think things will settle down, because the ratings killer for any reality television show is predictability, order, and stability, which of course are exactly what a global trade system needs. Now, in more practical terms, in terms of how we're going to see this play out, an important point I have to emphasize: ostensibly, at least, the EU and 6 countries have signed trade agreements with the United States. In my judgment, there are no trade agreements. There are no trade agreements. I started my career as a trade negotiator. I was on the US-Canada trade negotiations before NAFTA. That was a trade agreement. It took 2 years, and the document was this thick, okay? These are agreements which, in a couple of cases, we've got a couple of pages of bullet points, vague, unclear. In other cases, we don't even have a couple of pages of bullet points. We're in the very surreal position of relying on social media posts from the president to try to figure out what was the deal with this country, what was the deal with that country. So, because of the ambiguity involved, we don't really know how things are going to play out. And I can promise you there will be disputes and differences in interpretation. And in fact, we're already seeing some countries signaling, well, that's not quite the way we understood it. That's not quite the way we thought. That's not quite what we thought we agreed to. And many of the most difficult issues are subject to ongoing negotiations. So the trade negotiations really haven't even concluded. So I don't think we have any trade agreements. And I think what's going to happen is that in the worst case scenario, I will not be shocked if some of these quote unquote deals unravel and fall apart completely, or if we do end up with something approximating a trade deal, it could look very different from what our current understanding is of what these deals are going to look like. And I can only say, heaven help whatever country if the trade deals come off the tracks, because those reciprocal tariffs are not just going to go back to the previous level. He's going to be that much further annoyed, and I think they're going to be hiked up that much further. So again, things aren't settling down. In a reality show, you go through periods of relatively higher intensity and periods of lower intensity. Don't breathe a sigh of relief now that the reciprocal tariffs are quote unquote settled, because I don't think they're settled at all. For businesses in the region, I don't see how you can make any business decisions based on our current understanding, because by this time next week, you could be dealing with an entirely different world. Okay. Now, I want to spend a minute or two talking about a specific provision that I think is going to be a particular nightmare, and that is these transshipment provisions. Okay. As I sit here today, I have no idea how any of this is going to work. I have no idea how it's intended to work, or as a practical matter, how it will work. Now, if these provisions are intended to primarily or exclusively target illegal transshipments, okay? Illegal transshipments are, for the sake of a hypothetical example, product enters Vietnam from China. You rip the sticker off of it that says made in China. You slap a sticker on it that says made in Vietnam. You falsify the customs documentation and you ship that to America. That is illegal transshipment. It is fraud. It is like stealing money. Now, if these provisions are aimed at illegal transshipments, then we should all be thrilled with Donald Trump. Okay, anyone who values rule of law, anyone who is opposed to fraudulent behavior, we should all support this 100%. But if these transshipment provisions are instead also intended to counter what we would normally consider under trade rules to be legal acceptable transshipment, go back to our hypothetical example, product comes in from China, is sufficiently transformed or incorporated into a larger product so that according to rules of origin, it now becomes a product of Vietnam and is subsequently shipped to the United States. There should be no problem with that. But if they're somehow going to try to segregate out what's coming from China, apply different rates, this is a total nightmare. It is a total nightmare for customs in the United States. It is a total nightmare for customs in the exporting country, which, as a reminder, are responsible for issuing certificates of origin and have to figure this out. And again, anybody who manages supply chains for a living, get a new job, because this is just going to be an absolute nightmare to handle. Now, I think almost inevitably, this is going to descend into chaos. Nobody's really going to know what the heck they're doing. The United States will never be satisfied. We'll continue to think that products are being transshipped, and snapping back to the higher rates of reciprocal tariffs will be held over every country's head like the sword of Damocles. Okay, so this is a real, keep your eye on this, because I think this is really going to blow up and cause significant headaches for everybody involved. Now, I also want to draw your attention to another unfortunate issue that I don't think is getting enough attention. Now, on the off chance that there's anyone here who aren't experts in American history from the last 3 decades of the 19th century, let me sincerely encourage you to dust off your history books, because it's going to provide you with an excellent preview of what I think we're headed for. Because the last roughly 1870 to 1900 in the United States were what was known as the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age was, depending on your perspective, either the high water mark or the low water mark for crony capitalism. I think Trump, through his trade policies, through his trade deals, has set the United States on a course of crony capitalism that is going to make the Gilded Age look like a warm-up act. So just to tick through a handful of the things that he has done, which really glaringly open the door to crony capitalism. NVIDIA and AMD have essentially bought export licenses. They had sensitive chips that required an export license to be exported to China. They applied for licenses, and the Commerce Department ruled, no, you cannot export these. They're too sensitive to send to China. CEOs visit the Oval Office. A shockingly transparent quid pro quo. Nobody's really denying that this was the deal, the quote unquote deal. Those licenses are now green-lit. They've got their licenses. They can sell those chips to China. Oh, but they got to pay 15% of their sales in China to the United States. It is an absolutely classical pay-to-play scheme. It is a pay-to-play scheme, and something I never thought I would witness. Consider another example. As part of these big, beautiful trade deals, right, with at least a couple of countries, Japan, South Korea, astonishingly, these countries have agreed to put billions of dollars of investment funds at the discretion of President Trump. I mean, my goodness gracious, you know, the mind just boggles. President Trump is responsible for spending Japan's money on American companies. Now, what do you think companies might do to position themselves more favorably to be on the receiving end of these billions? And knowing Donald Trump, the consummate deal maker, what do you think Donald Trump might request from companies in exchange for being favored with some of these billions of dollars? Again, mind-boggling. Similar dynamic is at least potentially at play with the purchase agreements that many of these agreements contain, in which countries agree to billions of dollars to purchase US products. Well, my question is, okay, so what US companies are going to fill these purchase orders? And is the White House going to play any role in determining which companies might fill these purchase orders, and what might companies be willing to do to ensure that they get a piece of the action? Astonishingly, the US government has taken a stake in Intel. Okay, is now going to be part of Intel and has got a golden share in exchange for providing the Japanese with a green light to quote unquote invest in US steel. The US government will hold a golden share in US steel. Now, again, you reflect on these things and you realize that the Gilded Age could really look like nothing compared to this. We had, you know, some striking similarities. The Gilded Age were an era of high protectionism and very cozy relationships between businessmen and government officials. And the key point for all of us to keep in mind here is that crony capitalism only works out for the handful of oligarchs who enrich themselves and the politicians who otherwise benefit. But for everybody else, it is a losing proposition. And this is clearly, to an astonishing degree, the trajectory that I think President Trump has set us on scale for. So as I said, as bad as things are today, I'd be remiss if I didn't share with you my personal view that I think, in the respects that I've walked through, things are not going to settle down, and if anything, things will get worse rather than better. I wish I had a more optimistic message to deliver, but I'm sorry, those are my best judgments. Attendo, on that upbeat note, back to you.
Thank you, Steve. We are back to manufacturing gloom. I think that's the way it looks like. But anyway, thank you again. I mean, those are very realistic and very perceptive insights, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions, thoughts to coming. But before going on to that, I wanted to check something, Debbie and Steve, Mary, all of you. You know, I'm just trying to think about what might be the factors that might bring around a change in the way things are going. So this is not just trying to be deliberately optimistic, but just trying to think of, you know, maybe exogenous factors which might create a difference in the US. So I was thinking of a few which might make a difference. So one is the US reaches a deal with China. We are not sure about what the deal might be, but whether that might have a concomitant effect on tariffs with other countries and so on and so forth, or at least rein in this kind of a very odd policy action. The second is a deal with Russia, if that might have an impact. The third is, if in reaction to what is going on, there is a strong growth of an anti-US coalition, effectively. I mean, mostly emerging markets coming together, China, India, Russia, Indonesia, a few other countries, maybe even the BRICS, gathering momentum, whether that might be considered as a threat and whether that would thwart it. And finally, I was wondering if any kind of domestic, I would call it backlash, but, domestic resistance. I'm not really bringing in the midterm elections right here, right now. There's still quite a distance away. But could it be a situation where the US businesses, and particularly the US big businesses, start getting agitated over what is going on, and something kicks in at some stage, because technically the tariffs have just kicked in. So the numbers will become probably a little clear in another 2 months' time. So might this also be a factor which in some way can, lead to a situation where there is a rethink of the tariffs, and there is an effort to restore some sort of normalcy. So I'd just like to go around the table and gather your thoughts on that. Debbie, if I could start with you.
I mean, yeah, it would be great, but no. No, and I think the reasons for that are myriad. So one of the reasons why I started hyperventilating about Trump long before he got into office is that I said he has very few fixed points in his life, but one of them is he hates trade and he loves tariffs. And so whenever he is pushed on something, that's where he's going to go back to, because that's his favorite topic. He thinks he owns it, and he's clearly demonstrated in a shockingly short amount of time. There are no guardrails. He can do what he wants. He's been incredibly successful at it. And so far, we don't have any of what we expected as guardrails to stand up to him. That's not foreign leaders. It's not domestic leaders. It's not the business community. It's not Congress. It hasn't been the court system. He just is bowling over every kind of limit that he might have faced. Now, can he do that forever? That's a little less clear. I mean, I could paint a sort of slightly more optimistic figure when I say, well, if the US economy crashes, then things might turn around, but that's kind of not a great outcome, right? So the US economy crashes and then you have some sort of change, maybe. I mean, I don't see a lot of profiles and courage coming out of the business community yet. Maybe it happens. I'm not sure that Congress, even if we have midterms, it's too late by the time we get to, that's a year from now. And I'm still unconvinced that it's going to make a wild difference. Maybe it does. I don't know. I would love to have other countries band together and act cooperatively against the United States and say this is unacceptable. We've all talked endlessly about the need for the multilateral rules-based order, blah, 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 but nobody actually delivers on that. And so, in fact, my next piece out with us, with the Heinrich Foundation, is supposed to be on why isn't it? Why is it so hard to get a coalition to push back against the United States? And I think one of the things, there's many reasons for why he's been so successful. One is just that his speed is at a speed that is leaving everybody else in the dust, right? You're just not structurally set up to respond, either as companies or governments or whatever. You're just not set up for this kind of speed. And Trump isn't going to take a breath, right? This is his speed. Like, he is not going to slow down, because if he slows down, then the momentum could build. So you got to constantly keep up this insane pace to keep everybody off balance so they don't gang up together. So the speed is an issue. And the crucial problem is differential impacts. So places, companies, governments that have been affected only slightly have no interest in working with those who've been hit hard. Those who've been hit hard cannot get those who've been hit lightly to actually collaborate or cooperate in any way. And so his divide and conquer has worked, and I think is likely to continue to work for a while. And of course, the big question in everyone's mind as well is, well, why does this work so well? Why don't you just start trading outside the United States? Taimur Beg has now made an acronym, which I do like, TOTUS, trade outside the United States, TOTUS, that this is the new policy. And I think we will see that, because it's millions of firms that are making decisions that make up supply chains. They will ultimately end up with more of a TOTUS system. The problem is that the rest of the world, even though they're 85% of the global economy, they don't buy the same things, and they don't buy the same things in the same quantity, and they don't buy them in the same way. And so, yes, we'll be pivots. We'll have pivots elsewhere, but you can't instantly pivot, and you can't instantly replace the United States for an awful lot of things. And so again, it's the speed plus the timing plus the difficulties. I just don't see a lot that's going to rein him in the near term.
Mary, you would like to have some thoughts?
Well, I've often wondered, what if we disengaged? he likes attention. He loves being in the limelight. I think he really likes the fact that countries are running to him. It reminded me the other day when I saw a child having a bit of a meltdown and how the mother just ignored him, that he realized he wasn't getting the attention he needed. And he just stood up and went to play. It took a lot of, irritated the rest of us in the shop, but I think the mom was so, would that wake him up if we stopped engaging? But as Deb has said, what would it take for us to stop engaging? Because the US is not just an economic powerhouse. There are many, many different aspects to the US, and there are many different Gordian knots involved in that may not be so easy to unravel. So until we, find a way in which we can operate while listening to the tantrum will continue.
Thanks, Amatendo. Well, look, a couple of thoughts. In terms of your question, is there anything that can sort of mitigate or moderate Trump? To date, the only hint that we've seen that there might be something that gets his attention and causes a bit of a retrenchment in his trade policies is the bond market. Okay, so whether or not a steep and prolonged downturn in financial markets might do it, I don't know. But that's a Pyrrhic victory. That's curing the patient through bloodletting, right? That's not something I think any of us should be hoping for. In terms of business community, I've been struck because on more than one occasion, when the question has been put to him by reporters, and love Donald Trump or hate Donald Trump, but he gets in front of the press, man. He loves to talk and he's happy to opine on anything. So we do get visibility into what's going on inside that mind of his. And on more than one occasion, the question has been put to him, Mr. President, you're hearing from corporate leaders that these tariffs are killing them, going to start empty store shelves, layoffs, decline in profits, and he shrugged it off. He said, they like to complain, they'll adjust. Is basically, I'm paraphrasing, is how the number of times it's put to him. He's not like, oh my God, let me rethink this. It's, they like to complain, they'll get over it type of attitude. So I don't think the business community pressure is going to do much of it. Now, the other thing that you asked about, Amatendo, is what if we have some deals? What if we start to hit a critical mass of big, beautiful trade deals with big and important countries? I think you'll see only a temporary kind of calming down before the reality show mentality kicks in again. And the question I would ask you, and the question I would ask any country that agrees to a trade agreement with Donald Trump, I would look you straight in the eye and I'd say, what evidence do you see that Donald Trump will honor any trade agreement that he has signed? Because I don't see the evidence. So even as you posited, Amatendo, what if we do get some of these trade agreements? Maybe a short-term uptick. But as I said, I think the agreements in one way or another will fall apart sooner or later.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Thanks, Marie, Deb. So to move on to the questions and comments now, Sandeep, you wanted to start?
Thank you very much. I learned a lot and it was a very interesting session, which I imagined it would be just by title. But I thought at the risk of making it a little bit more interesting, I wanted to ask a provocative question, which was, can I do a slightly push back against the Trump-centric aspect nature of this analysis? Trump is certainly a unique historical figure. Nobody has to question that. But in a couple of ways, I was thinking, one is how uniquely historical are these policies? I'm thinking just from India's perspective, for example. There is one school of thought in India which thinks that we have been here before. Americans have had unreasonable trade policies several times in the past. Like in 1960s, to induce agricultural reform in India, they put ship-to-mouth policy, which kind of, from Indian perspective, risk famine. In late 1980s, they put Super 301 to try to open up the investment, and ironically, from an Indian perspective, was actually jeopardizing the nascent liberalization that was happening in India. Or in late 90s, there was the nuclear bomb and the so how the US also has history of trade war with Japan and all sorts of things, right? I'm not saying that what is happening right now is not unique, but to what degree is it unique, right? Like, and similarly, second aspect of this is this round of what Trump's attack on globalization. How much of that is just this administration? Are there structural factors at play of what US was doing during Obama's administration or what continued during Biden administration? Or there, perhaps there are some, can we separate to a certain degree what Trump is doing versus a US policy minus Trump, in which also an approach to globalization is not going back to the 2000s, but something else altogether. So perhaps thinking about that would have some other way of thinking about the future beyond just Trump. So yeah, that one.
Steve, would you like to take that? Yeah.
Well, look, I appreciate the question, and I appreciate your point, and I think it's a fair one. My judgment is that, taking your points on board, on balance, this is different. Okay, this is different for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you just look at the percentage of global trade that's covered by these reciprocal tariffs, and I don't even know if this includes the sector-specific tariffs, but we're talking about somewhere between 60 and 70% of global trade. The other problem that we've got is these other countries, EU and 6 other countries, have basically joined the United States in undermining, eviscerating most favored nation. And I worry that once you break such a foundational principle of FMN, can you pick up the pieces again? I'm not sure you can. And to get, you know, when the biggest ape in the jungle lays down the law and says, we're not going to do law of the jungle, we're all going to agree to a set of rules and play by a set of rules, as the United States did in 1948, the other apes in the jungle have no choice but to go along. When the biggest ape says, screw the rules, we're going back to law of the jungle, I think it empowers the other apes in the jungle in whatever way they can, in whatever corner of the jungle they can, to also adapt the same approach. So I hope I'm wrong, but I do think this time is different. I think the foundational principles of the system have been undermined to an extent that you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. I hope I'm wrong.
Okay. Several questions I can. So maybe what I'll do is I'll just go by in the order in which I spotted the hands. So Rohan first, you sir after, and then Dipender. Thank you, Rohan.
Thank you very much for these really interesting talks. I mean, a variation on Sandeep's question, but just the focus on Trump. I'm wondering, like, is the US now that kind of dictatorship where this one person is making all the decisions and the policy? What is the thinking, I guess, of the other people there? Is there, like, you know, Jameson Greer or Peter Navarro, people like that, are they all on board because they're afraid of Trump? Or is there an actual economic argument being made behind all of this? And what is that argument? Or is this pure MAGA domestic politics signaling to the base? And at what point does domestic politics feed back into this in a way that might change course?
I'll make some quick comments. So one on the Trump, what makes Trump different? It's a great question. I think it's because it's a Trump plus a weak system. I think that's what makes this so dangerous, this period that we're in right now. If it was just Trump against a functioning global system with strong and empowered leaders outside the US, we might not have the same damage. But I think Trump plus a weak system plus weak leaders in other places has been a catastrophe. So I think that's what makes it different from before. And his willingness to try new things that we didn't imagine is also an issue. And so you can't go back again. Right. So even after Trump is gone, let's imagine, sake of argument, the man drops dead from a heart attack this evening. We already have enough damage. I'm not sure that you can fix this easily, either in the US or outside the US. So that is, and every day that he's in office, we have more challenges coming from this. So who's running this, I think, is a great question. Nobody. That is so, the thing that is so like, there's so many things that are shocking about this administration, but one is this is being driven by the Oval Office and like 5 guys, maybe, all men, and maybe not even 5. And you say, well, who are those 5? Well, actually, it's really unclear who those 5 are. Most of them have no trade experience. You know, Jameson Greer, you mentioned, USTR, wasn't even informed that there was going to be a deal with Japan, right? So, I mean, this is a guy who doesn't really matter, despite his efforts, who does know about trade. Lutnick knows nothing and says less. Besant is in the room, but I don't think is able to participate in these conversations either. So you're actually got this lunatic Navarro who occasionally comes and goes. And of course, the Indian audience is going to be very familiar with Navarro because he's come back in the headlines over that. Stephen Miller, who has nothing to say about this, is somehow involved, and Trump himself, who believes that ultimately he is the expert on these topics. It is a system the likes of which the US, I don't know if it's ever seen that, or certainly not in my lifetime have we had this kind of concentration of power with absolutely no agency discussions whatsoever, no collaboration and coordination between agencies, ministries, departments, et cetera. It just doesn't happen, which is partly why we have this completely schizophrenic policy. Invest in the United States and we're going to deport your people. Huh. It's just a lack of coordination.
Maybe in the interest of time, what we will do is we'll just gather the questions and then we can have the responses from the experts. So, sir, if I could start from you.
Yes, thank you very much for the insights and the lovely panel discussion. So many parts to comment on, but I just wanted to make first a comment. So I represent the European Union office here in Singapore. We have not concluded a trade agreement nor signed an FTA with the US. We only had a deal in Scotland, which then resulted in a joint statement on a framework, which is a non-legally binding document. We are still in process of discussing with the US, but also for the sake of clarity, any good or industrial good that is exported from the US to the EU still is subject to MFN tariff rates. We need a legal decision to apply 0 tariffs for US imported goods. Again, a lot was being said, but also on our side, we decided not to retaliate. I think that's also something important that we have in common with many Asian countries, or also countries with FTAs that did not, or decided not to activate the dispute settlement in their FTAs with the US, like Singapore. But for me, when I look at the question of this discussion, what lies ahead, maybe I didn't hear enough about those countries that are willing to maybe unite in a coalition which is not directly anti-US, but is pro-trade. And I'm referring as well to this article that was recently published in the Financial Times on this new future of investment and trade partnership that is apparently being negotiated by Singapore as well. So, but also because I think Deborah also mentioned that we have been discussing over the last 20 years WTO reform. So in your view, what is actually the best way ahead? Like, should we reset? Should we build a new organization? Should we do a coalition of the willing with existing regional trade agreements that already are there? How should we go ahead for the future of rules-based trade?
Dipinder?
Thank you. Thank you again very much for the very stimulating conversation. 2 quick points, if I may. Steve, you drew an analogy to the Gilded Age and the robber barons. I mean, today they are the hedge fund owners. They come from the financial domain. And one thing that really checked Trump and dead in his tracks, as you pointed out, was the increase in interest rates, which has very severe potential knock-on effects. I mean, it could undermine the credibility of the dollar itself, and the ability to service any debt. And that's what in large measure led to the recurring 90-day rollbacks and the Taco syndrome from that FT journalist. Do you see a scenario where a market-determined solution could possibly, or market-determined response could possibly put a halt to this? I also see the strongest response coming in from some of the closest US allies, historically the closest, and that's the EU, but they hobbled because of security constraints and the inability to plow any funds in a meaningful sense in a short time into Ukraine. And likewise for Japan and Korea, they're heavily dependent. So they're coming into the talks, but they're, aside from the market, their hands severely tied behind their backs. And just to make an effort to look at the brighter side of things, I think Liz mentioned the conversation, but I just want to pick on the previous point. If you look at the hard data, total trade has not gone down a great deal. It's been severely, dramatically redirected as well. And there's a large cohort of very medium-sized and smaller players who are playing according to the WTO rules. There's just the strong yearning for the appellate tribunal to be reincarnated in some form or the other. Do you see the green shoots of any hopes in that direction? Thank you.
Okay, and okay, Ivan, yeah.
Well, first, thank you for a very insightful and gloomy discussion, as it should be on this topic. I have two questions for you. One question is, obviously this will have very large impact on the trade policy on the other two big apes in the jungle, that is China and the European Union. Especially, what do you think the effects will be on their trade policy toward third parties, not toward the US? And of course, we have been speaking about potential coalitions and so on, but it's very difficult to believe that this won't impact their trade policy on the longer run toward other actors in very substantial ways. And my second question is toward Mr. Olson, who made this, I think, very good parallel with the Gilded Age. This, I mean, if this parallel is accurate, and I think it is, this will probably affect the way American business behaves and operates in drastic ways, because the robber baron age was corrupt, inefficient. I mean, it was almost gangster business in some ways, and they had constant fights with labor and so on. It got extremely ugly. So how do you think American business is going to change in response to this? Because I'm sure that the change will be very substantial. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you again. Very interesting and insightful discussion. I'm Luciano, Brazilian ambassador here in Singapore. A few comments in a question. I think it's really in a situation like this, and it's very complicated to countries to act collectively. And you see, I think at the beginning you saw, well, there might be, it seems like so unreasonable that countries wouldn't try to get together and put a reaction on this. But then I think every leader, every country has responsibilities to their own constituencies, and in this kind of fear of missing out, oh, I have to go there, I have to do something, because it might get worse. Things might get worse. So I need to do something to this. So I think understandably, this kind of divide and rule strategy, in the end, it works. And it's really very difficult to have a kind of collective action or reaction towards this kind of situation. Something that I think it's very hard thinking about the future of the multilateral trading system. Again, how comments that all of you made, I mean, if you have those agreements, and how will be possible if they stick, if they go along, if they are implemented, how all these partners will be able to keep the most favored nations to each other is not technically is not feasible. So what we're looking is that we are looking, particularly trade with the West, all trade will be preferential trade somehow. And then you have all these technical questions, how have the rules of origin, valuation, so on and so forth. Really, it's very hard to be optimistic in the future looking at this. You mentioned this comparison with the end of the 19th century. Think about historical cycles. There's one important difference, I think, I'd like to have your view on this, is that now, unlike at the time, I think the US seems to have this feeling of vulnerability that was not historically. You're going up. Now people, possibly wrong, think you are going down. And then I think that affects very much the mentality and how people will see these things. And connect to this, is there any effort right now, or it's possible to envisage somehow an effort to articulate a notion of national interest that somehow can make sense out of all of this? So it's just the retail thing. Well, that the interest is there. I'm getting money, or I'm selling more, or I'm importing lias, and so on. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And just to check if I haven't missed, I hope I haven't missed any hands. Okay, so we are already past 4:30, but that's okay. We'll definitely be spending the next few minutes discussing this. Mary, can I start with you? Maybe the question which this gentleman asked, and obviously there is a Singapore role in that.
Okay, so I think we issued a press release or working something to clarify. So what we're trying to do in that Financial Times article is actually to see how to keep the WTO relevant. I think all of us, and I just mentioned it to somebody this morning, that out of 166 WTO members, 165 are generally playing by the rule book. We only have one outlier at this point in time. So what are we trying to do, the coalition? So we're actually trying to go back, and it takes a crisis. So maybe this is a bit of the silver lining. The crisis is that now you know what happens if you breach the MFN rule. Chaos can account for it. And then there's a lot of deal making, and basically you're going back to a situation which you wanted to avoid when you set up the WTO. Even I go back to the GATT or the Bretton Woods agreement. So are the 165 going to tolerate this dissent, especially the developing countries who, from the WTO reports, have really benefited over the 30 years that the WTO has been in existence? Poverty has been alleviated, and one of the outcomes of it is rising economic powers who were formerly developing countries. And so that threat of competition is not being dealt with properly by those who are facing an economic decline. Instead of trying to have a fair and equitable world, they are resorting to a lot of interesting measures to cling on with their fingertips rather, to their supremacy, but econs goes in cycles. So how do we address this? And so we're trying to see WTO reform is square on the agenda for MC14. So is this then the crisis then to get the WTO members to start working better together? I don't think we need to get rid of the WTO. Most of the WTO is working well. The appellate body issue started because there was indeed overreach by the Legal Affairs Division and some appellate body members, and we have to acknowledge that and then deal with how you're going to address that. How are you going to appoint? What are the criteria to be a candidate to be an appellate body member? Should you have been a panelist? Should you be legally trained? You be an economist? Because if you don't have the right caliber, and I've been a panelist for 5 disputes, so I can speak with some internal knowledge. If you don't have the knowledge, the Legal Affairs Division will run the case for you. And so do you really want that? If you wanted that, then you wouldn't have to have a dispute settlement or appellate body. So we need to acknowledge that the system was not working well and then address it. And until we address it, and it's not even right to say that the dispute settlement system is dead, because there was a recent video for the WTO Public Forum which shows that majority of cases going to the WTO still are resolved at the panel stage. There's very little appeal into the void except by a certain country. So for the bulk of the membership, it's still working, it's still implemented, it's still being taken forward. So we always say it takes a crisis. To answer some of the earlier points, I would say what is different today is social media. You have social media, and because of the WTO, and you have an integrated supply chain and value chain that took advantage of lowering of trade barriers, it is very difficult to decouple or delink everything. And so it is not really history repeating itself. The factors are still there, and that's what should forewarn us not to let it repeat. I raised this point under Trump 1. So we all forget this is Trump's second round. He tried to address the issues in Trump 1. And I did ask, are you thinking of maybe, dealing how you dealt with Japan? Because Japan agreed to the 7 agreements and export restraints and everything. But China is different. China was not going to agree. And so obviously Trump 1 policies didn't work in curbing and improving the comparative advantage of US industry. And so he's come back with a second strategy. But nowadays, I mean, that's why he's great. He's through social media, isn't it? Because he knows that the average citizen is not reading a newspaper, not reading any of the papers we are writing. They're watching social media. And so he addresses it that way. And that is why things are a bit different. Trade policies towards non-US, we don't see a difference yet. In ASEAN, we have had a few conversations. Some of my ASEAN colleagues are in the middle of deals, but as I said, it is because, as Stephen also said, the politicians will say, so aren't you trying to do something? There's a lot of misunderstanding as to who really pays the tariff burden, what really trade is all about. They just say, okay, I've got a higher rate. What are you trying to do to improve things for us, failing to account that maybe you're in a deficit and it's not going to make much of a difference. But if you're in a surplus, then what about those surplus products? Is the US still being able to buy? Because as I said, the shoe is on the US foot. And for how long can they do that? Does it mean, and contracts are in place. It's not just because suddenly I've got a lower tariff that the contract deal that Walmart may have with China, he's going to break it and say, okay, I'm going to buy from Singapore because we are 10%, because there's a lot of legal unraveling that needs to be done there as well. So there's this perception, but because of social media is giving, so what lies ahead? I am going to be optimistic. I'm going to be optimistic and say that this is a crisis to which we can use to finally get some positive thoughts, discussion on WTO reform, because the devil is at the gate. You know what? If you don't reform, all these scenarios about the full breakdown of MFN and the retorting into the Wild Wild West, do we really want that? Or are we going to try and do our best now to look at issues that have been on the table since the time Pascal Lamy was a WTO DG? There is the unfinished Doha development agenda issues. A lot of the ills that people are putting at China's door is actually because the WTO has not discussed the Doha development issues that were supposed to address these issues. We didn't bring competition back into the WTO. We have unfinished agriculture. We have non-tariff measures. We have trade remedies reform. It was all, I mean, I was fortunately or unfortunately part of the Doha team, that drafted the declaration. So I know it a bit too well, maybe. But so is it time now to go back? Either say it's dead and start afresh, but stop this lingering, because it's not taking the rest of the 165 anywhere. So I would say that it's optimistic for the multilateral rules. Move ahead. If that one doesn't want to join us, so be it. But we move ahead and try to do our best to preserve what has worked for the rest of us for the last 30 years.
That's more hopeful, Mary. So I'll go to Steve and Deb, come back to you there.
Thank you, Amatendu. Look, I'll really do this as a lightning round and really just make a couple brief comments that I think will be responsive to at least most of the very good questions and comments that we received. In terms of this question, okay, so what's the path forward? What should we do? The comment I would make there is, look, for those countries out there who actually believe in the system, who actually believe in this concept of a mutually beneficial rules-based global trade system, What are you waiting for? You know, stand up. The ship is sinking. Like you've got to save the ship now or it's going to go under. So I think, you know, I'm looking at the European Union. I'm looking at Japan. I'm looking at Australia. I'm looking at Canada. Well, certainly it's Singapore. Other countries that really believe in it. Now is the time to stand up, and to the extent you can, try to strengthen some type of coalition of the willing, as you said. Now, in terms of how this is going to play out, how relations are going to work between third countries, I think we're at a tipping point that can go either way. Either the formidable cracks in the foundation of MFN will either be the beginning of the end, or it will sufficiently scare people so that there'll be a critical mass to say, hey, let's not blow this. You know, let's not blow this. Let's not let this thing fall apart. And there'll be a critical mass of people trying to revive it. I don't know which way that will break. I think it's on the knife's edge. In terms of whether or not this return to a Gilded Age could fundamentally change businesses, I think the question is the extent to which a culture change takes place within American corporations. And I don't think we're going to have we'll have the answer to that for a few years. In terms of market-driven responses, maybe changing something. The only thing I'd say about Trump is leopards don't change their spots. He's a 78-year-old man. He hates globalization. He hates trade, and he loves tariffs. Well, if any of you'd like to follow up after the session with me, please do. Let's exchange cards.
It's worth following up. I can assure you, Steve. Yeah, there you go.
Thanks. I'm just going to make two comments quickly and then go to the WTO. So let me just remind everybody that so far most of the action is in trade and goods. We haven't discussed trade and services, and we haven't discussed a lot of other elements that are important. And so let's see whether we expand out of just trade and goods and into these other areas or not. Because, you know, if we hit services, that's a whole new challenge ahead of us. The second point that I would make, which I thought was a good one, was about some of these what I call these napkin deals. A lot of these napkin deals were reached because governments said, of course, we have trade issues, but we also have this sort of security concerns. And the US is very important on the security side. So we need to be very careful about how we balance this. And I would just give a word of warning, which is, what makes you think that a guy who is perfectly happy to rip up the economic side of this equation is actually going to stick to his word on the security side? And so I think for a lot of governments that are weighing like, okay, I'll take anything in economics to keep the security bonds, I would say be careful, because I don't see any evidence that he's actually cares about the security bonds either. So, you know, that's a tough trade-off, but I think it's worth reflecting on. So that's the Trump discussions. Let me then turn quickly to the international system. My first job actually with the Heinrich Foundation was to make a video on WTO negotiations in particular, and about how difficult it is to get 164 at the time to order lunch. And I made a video about getting lunch for 164 people, given the constraints. And it turns out you're not going to eat. We're all going to starve to death. And so that is a perpetual problem for the WTO. And I don't think now we're at 166 minus 1 either. I think we have a number of countries that are spoilers in our lunch order. It's not just the United States blocking ordering lunch. It's a lot of other places for different reasons. Not a lot, but it's a handful of countries that are blocking the order of lunch for different reasons that are creating real challenges. So if you can't get all of us to order lunch, what do? You default to smaller groupings. And I would say, for me, one path forward that is promising, but is taking time, much more time than we actually have, are the creations of these sort of coalitions of the willing, if you will. Let's build on what already exists, the most obvious of which to me is the EU CPTPP connection. 39 governments that ought to be committed to trade. It's a ready-made sort of framework. It doesn't mean that they're joining, just to be clear. I'm not suggesting the EU and the CPTPP somehow merge or join, but that these 39 governments could have a much tighter collaboration together. And the worry that we've had so far has been, but what will Trump do to us if we do that? And I would say, what do you think he's already done to you? Like, what are you waiting for? You've already seen an awful lot of problems defend the system, defend what matters to you, starting with the 39. I think that's great. And then this Singapore initiative, this FITP, which has got to get a better name, I think is important because it's a different way of thinking about coalitions. So we just need to be very creative in response to crisis, to how do we develop those concentric circles of collaboration and cooperation in wherever and whatever format they take. Let's go for it, because this is not a time where we have the luxury to sort of sit back and say, well, let's take another 20 years and maybe we'll get where we would like to go. We don't have that kind of time. So we need to come up with whatever works in the moment in which it works. As long as we're headed in the right direction, fantastic.
Thank you so much, Devi. In fact, talking about better names, we have had the genius, and now we are looking at higher. Higher is basically where you start taxing outsourcing of jobs. So India is pretty much now in the higher scheme of things, and there's more excitement. And actually, Debbie, that point was very important. We didn't really discuss the services, but I guess the next round of actions is going to come in there. And Steve, the point that you mentioned on the bond markets, so particularly through the currency and the US debt. So there's a lot more, obviously, that we will need to follow as we go ahead. And I'm very happy to share with you that this is something which we will keep on doing repeatedly as often as we can. I'm not too sure whether that will help in, constructive enlightenment, but at least I hope that it will help in keeping the conversation alive on this subject, which is extremely important, because otherwise I think there's a lot that just is coming down from the top and without much depth in the whole narrative. So thank you so much again, Debbie, Steve, and Mary. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody. So we will be posting this conversation on the YouTube, I suspect, at some stage, Yusuf. Yeah. So please follow us and let us know about what you think, and join us again in future, and wish you a very good evening. Thank you very much.